Welcome to the Montshire Museum of Science. My name is Rachel Donegan, and I'm on the education staff here. And we're really delighted to host the latest in the series by the Upper Valley Pollinators Partnership, which are all listed on one of these slides. And I wanted to thank everyone. Some of you were probably here last Saturday for our Montshire Day for Science. We had some marchers from Dartmouth that came over from the college, and it was our biggest day ever. We had over 1,400 people. It's a free day. We opened up the museum to everybody for free. And the place was packed. We had a bunch of speakers from the college and advocating for climate change education and for science research, and it was a really great day. We also have a special event day coming up that's part of our Making Music exhibition, so we're going to have special performances. That is this Saturday, April 29th. You're all welcome to that. And our big auction, our big fundraiser auction is May 5th, and there's still time to sign up. It's a big party, really good food, and lots of great items to bid on. So we do a silent auction and a live auction, and it's a really big night. So please join us for that. So I'm going to pass it over to Barbara McElroy.
Okay, I just have a few brief announcements about this series. If you picked up the little blue list of all the events that are planned, this is the last indoor event. All the others are out in the field somewhere. And we'll be learning how to do a pollinator assessment as far as the vegetation there. We'll also be learning about assessing the pollinators themselves. Maybe when all is said and done, we'll all know the difference between a honeybee and a wild bee, and on a fake bee called a hoverfly. So this series has been really interesting, and I've I guess I'm the coordinator, but I have, raise your hand if you've helped with this planning at some stage or other, whether it was fixing food for visitors or helping plant seeds or all the other things that we have been doing as far as planning these events. And it's several organizations. There are more than 40 groups, conservation groups, plus 16 of those are schools that are growing pollinator plants. And on the back table, you'll see 3 little native bee balm plants that have a poster about them. So these are, I'm sure our speakers are going to be discussing these. So the goal of the Upper Valley Pollinator Partners is that we are going to promote the awareness of the decline of native pollinators and inspire actions to reverse the decline. And this committee set a goal of 100 new pollinator gardens in the Upper Valley. So on the back table, there's a sheet that you can sign to say, yes, I'm going to grow a pollinator garden. And I'm hoping that you will do that and then be willing to report on its progress. So other than that, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Ed Chamberlain, who's the chairman of the Hanover Conservation Commission. He's going to moderate. Joyce Knowles is going to be the timer. And the 2 speakers, where did you go? And this is being filmed by public television, CATV, in White River. So make sure you get your questions in there if you didn't write them on that board. Good, thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. So this evening, we're fortunate to have 2 speakers from the UNH Cooperative Extension Office in Europe. Can you hear me? Kathy Neal and Amy Papanow. And Amy is going to be first speaking to us. She, until recently, was a field specialist for the Merrimack County Extension Office. Where she was, she consulted and held educational programs for horticultural and landscaping and agricultural interests in New Hampshire. She has a bachelor's and master's degree from UNH, and the conversation that I had with her a little earlier, she hasn't strayed far away from home as she's back there working again. In the Cooperative Extension Program, she has been a member of the Landscape and Greenhouse Horticultural Team and the Pesticide Safety Education Team. And she's now with the Cooperative Extension at the university itself. Related to our interest in native pollinators, Amy has led a grant-funded Northern New England pollinator habitat working groups starting in 2014. And this multidisciplinary group was established to share information, assess critical research and outreach needs, and identify emerging issues in conservation, maintenance, and enhancement of pollinator habitat across the northern New England. So without much ado, I'll introduce Amy. We're going to use this mic. Amy, back now.
All right. Let's see. Oh, I heard it. Woo. Okay. All right, yeah, so I'm Amy Papano from UNH Cooperative Extension. If this is too loud, there's someone to adjust it, I think. So I'm going to start us out tonight talking about bees. I imagine you're all here because you have an interest in bees and pollinators and supporting pollinators. So I'm going to talk about bees, and then I'm going to pass it over to Kathy to talk about what you can do in the landscape to actually plant stuff to support the bees. So most people, I think, are pretty familiar with honeybees. So tonight what I'm going to focus on are the other bees that play a big role in our landscape, and that's our native bees. So pollinators are really an important part of certainly our food systems. So many of our fruit and vegetable crops require insects for pollination. There's some crops that we is this like really obnoxious? Yes. Can I just yell? Yes. I don't have control over it. I can try that. All right, how's that? Better? Okay, starting over. So a lot of our fruit and vegetable crops do require insects for pollination. Things like apples and strawberries are commonly thought of as the flowers will grow, but if you don't have an insect that comes to pollinate that flower, you aren't going to get that fruit to set. Vegetables as well, pumpkins and tomatoes and squash, that sort of thing. But insect pollination is also important for a lot of our other food crops and foods that we might not think about. An example would be broccoli. So you can plant broccoli seeds and grow a broccoli plant, and you can harvest that broccoli and eat it, and no pollinators ever have to touch it. But if we want to grow seed to grow broccoli in the future, then we need to let some of those broccoli plants flower, and they need to be pollinated, and that's what's going to cause the seed to set. So there's a lot of our fruit and vegetable crops, even those that we don't think of as being insect pollinated, we do need the insect pollination for the long-term propagation of those crops. Also, our beef and dairy industry is reliant on insect pollination. Cows eat a lot of alfalfa, and along those same lines, if we're going to grow alfalfa seed to plant for those cows, we need to let alfalfa flower and be pollinated for the seed to set. So really, insect pollination is responsible for a huge portion of our food. So I always like to have a quick biology lesson when talking about bees. Why do bees visit flowers? It's not because they're really hard workers and they know they have to be out there pollinating. It's because they want to eat and they want to feed their offspring. So bees are visiting flowers to collect nectar, which is their carbohydrate source, their sugars, their energy. And they're visiting flowers to collect pollen, which is their protein and their amino acids. And so they're consuming these themselves, and they're also gathering large amounts of this to bring back as food for their offspring. So as they're doing this, so this is an apple flower. These are the anthers, and that's where the pollen grows. And then the nectaries are down here at the base. That's where the nectar is. So as bees are coming to this flower and they're wiggling their way down in here to get some nectar, they're brushing up against the pollen. Sometimes they're also collecting pollen. They're getting it onto their bodies. They fly to the next flower. Some of that pollen rubs off. And so they are unintentionally pollinating as they go. All right, so just a little bit about honeybees. So honeybees are not native bees. Honeybees were brought over to the US with the European settlers in the 1600s. And at that time, they became naturalized in our environment. They went out and they took up residence in the edges of the woods, what people refer to bee trees, so the hollow trees that would have a honeybee hive inside them. And they lived that way, kind of coexisting with our native bees for a long time. It's only been in the last 20 years or so that almost all of our feral honeybee colonies have died out. So today, if you see a honeybee, it probably belongs to a beekeeper. So we do have some feral colonies that pop up now and then. They're usually pretty short-lived, a year or two, maybe 3. But by and large, honeybees really are reliant on people here in the US. In the countries where they're native, they're totally healthy, they're doing fine, they're living wild. But here in the US, where they're not native, it's the beekeepers that are propagating those bees. The honeybees are declining for a number of reasons, and we can say with confidence that there's not any one reason that the honeybees are declining. So it's really a combination of lots of stresses, all acting on them simultaneously, and it's just more than they can handle. They have parasites. This is a varroa mite. It would be like having a giant tick on yourself, sucking out your juices. So that's a big stressor on the honeybees. There are diseases, there are bacterial diseases, fungal diseases that are affecting them. They're certainly exposed to pesticides anywhere that they go in the environment. But then a big factor, and one that we can all do something about, is poor nutrition. So as our landscape has become more developed and more fragmented, there's just not as much open space with lots of flowers for the bees to feed from, and so they're not getting all the nutrition they need. They're not getting enough pollen and nectar, they're not getting the diversity of pollen and nectar, and so that's something where we can help. We can plant pollinator meadows, pollinator gardens, and give them some of that nutrition that they're lacking. The honeybees aren't the only bee. We also have hundreds of species of native bee. So in New Hampshire, where I am, Sandra Rehan, who's a researcher at the University of New Hampshire, and her team have been surveying the New Hampshire bees, and they have identified, at this point, I think 189 native bee species in New Hampshire, and they expect to find quite a few more as they continue doing these surveys. And these bees are incredibly diverse. They're different sizes, they live in different places, they're out at different times of the season, they feed on different plants, they have different roles in the ecosystem. And they're just really important, both in agriculture and our natural landscapes. So in the fields and forests and wetlands, those native plants are being pollinated primarily by our native bees. And they co-evolve together. So if we didn't have our native bees out there pollinating those native plants, they wouldn't set seed, they wouldn't reproduce, they wouldn't be forming berries and seeds for wildlife. These are the native plants that are filtering our water and filtering our air. So the bees are really a keystone species in this natural ecosystem. They're also really important to our local agriculture. So here in northern New England, almost all of our crops can be pollinated by our native bee populations. So a lot of our farmers do bring in honeybees to supplement, but if they got rid of the honeybees, most of them would still get all their crops pollinated. So we have enough native bees in our environment that they will be out there pollinating those vegetable crops. All right, so just a little of some great things about bees, native bees, and what makes them really good pollinators. So if you compared one honeybee to one native bee, on average, the native bees are going to be much more effective pollinators for a number of reasons. One is that they forage earlier in the morning and later in the evening. And this is important, particularly for some of our native species, of native flowering species, that that flower very early in the morning or very late in the evening, and there wouldn't be honeybees foraging at that time to pollinate them. So those plants are totally dependent on our native bees. A lot of our native bees will forage in cool, damp weather. So if you raise honeybees, you know that they're not going to come out if it's a little bit chilly or a little bit drizzly. But you can see this bumblebee up here. She's wet and soggy and cold, but that won't stop them. You would see bumblebees out foraging today, for example, when it's cold and rainy. Our native bees typically forage for pollen more often. So this is important. So honeybees forage for lots of nectar. So they need to create enough honey to sustain their colony over the winter. Our native bees are not active during the winter. They're either larvae or eggs, or hibernating adults. And so they're not eating over the winter. They don't need to build up honey, but what they do need is a lot of protein. And so they're out foraging for pollen, and when they do that, they're making a lot more mess of pollen and moving more pollen between flowers. Honeybees can often wiggle their way down into a flower, get some nectar, and get out without ever even touching the pollen. Our native bees also, many of them collect the pollen on their bellies. So they have sticky hairs on their abdomen, and rather than sticking the pollen in pollen sacs like honeybees do, and like this bumblebee does, they often stick it right to their bellies. And so again, they're just making a bigger mess of pollen, moving it onto more flower parts. Our native bumblebees do something called buzz pollination, and this is really important for some of our plants. This is like a tomato and pepper. They have their pollen is tucked tightly into these anthers, and so it's not free to stick to, say, a honeybee. But a bumblebee will grab onto those anthers and vibrate their flight muscles, and that will shake that pollen loose. And then they can collect that pollen and take it with them, and then that pollen is also loose, so if a honeybee comes along behind them, they can do some more of that pollination. Bumblebees also do this with blueberries. It's an important one there, things they pollinate. All right, so what our native bees need in their environment, they really need two things. They need forage, they need food, pollen and nectar from flowers, and they need nesting habitat. So the nesting habitat of our native bees is very different from what you would be familiar with honeybees. So our native bees are primarily either cavity nesters or ground nesters. And so our cavity nesting bees, they lay their eggs in cavities. So for example, a dead tree where beetles have bored holes, some pithy twigs, so something like sumac or roses or raspberries that have either a hollow stem or a very soft-centered stem, they will dig into that and lay their eggs. We have ground nesting bees that will dig tunnels into the ground to lay their eggs. And the important thing to realize about most of our native bees is that they're solitary. So where honeybees grow in large perennial colonies, where there's a whole colony of bees working together, our native bees, most of them, it's just one female doing her own thing, collecting pollen and nectar, putting it in the nest, laying her eggs, and then she dies, and she never sees her babies. And so for this reason, because they're largely solitary, they're not aggressive. So a honeybee has a colony to defend, and they will defend it aggressively. She's there by herself. She's not going to be interested in stinging people. She can, but it's pretty rare because they're not defending anything. So when you talk about ground nesting bees, it's important to realize that these are not ground nesting bees. These are wasps, and they're also a really important part of our ecosystem, but they're not what we're talking about when we're talking about bees. They're actually carnivores. You can see this wasp up here is eating another insect. So they do visit flowers to collect nectar, but they're not there collecting pollen, so they get all their protein from eating other insects. And so there are solitary wasps as well, but the communal wasps, they do also guard their colonies pretty aggressively. All right, so I just want to tell you about the life of a native bee to kind of get you familiar with what these things do, because they are so different than the honeybees that we're used to. So this is a native bee that's important here in northern New England, It's a mason bee. This is the blue orchard bee, and it's active for just about 6 weeks out of the year, and it's right around apple bloom. So these are an important pollinator of our apple crops. She's a cavity nesting bee. So in the spring, the male and female blue orchard bees hatch out of their nest. They mate. The males die. The fertilized female goes to work laying her eggs. So she will find a cavity or several cavities. And she's a mud bee, a mason bee. So the first thing she does is she goes out and finds a mud puddle, and she uses her front legs and her mandibles to collect mud. And she wiggles her way into whatever cavity she's found, and she packs the mud in. And then she wiggles her way out backwards, and she goes to get more mud. And she comes back and packs it in. So it takes her about 10 trips to get enough mud to make this one partition. And then she heads out to get pollen and nectar. So this thing right here is bee bread. So that's a mixture of pollen and nectar. So she's going to fly out and visit some flowers, and she's going to collect nectar and store it in her crop. And she's going to collect pollen and stick it to her belly. And she's going to visit about 75 flowers on one trip, anywhere between 45 and 75. She's going to come back, wiggle her way into the cavity, regurgitate the nectar, wiggle her way out, turn around, wiggle her way back in, scrape the pollen off, mix it together, wiggle her way out, and then she's going to go get some more. And it might take her anywhere from 15 to 30 trips to get enough pollen and nectar to make this one little ball of bee bread. And then on her last trip, she just collects nectar, and she comes in and she regurgitates it here to make a nice sticky surface. And she wiggles her way out and turns around, wiggles her way in, and lays an egg right here, stuck to that surface. And then she goes and gets more mud and more pollen and nectar, and lays an egg, and more mud and more pollen and nectar, and lays an egg. And she keeps doing this for her entire life, which is only about 6 weeks. And by that time, she's exhausted, and her wings are tattered because she's been wiggling her way inside and out, and eventually she can't fly anymore, and she dies. And so she might fill up 5 or 6 of these cavities with eggs before she dies. And so then these eggs develop, and once they hatch out, they have their food right there to eat. They eat, and the next spring they hatch out, and it starts all over again. And so that's kind of the life of most of our native bees, whether they're cavity nesters or ground nesters. It's primarily that one female doing what she can to lay as many eggs as she can before either her wings don't work anymore or she just reaches the end of her life. So it's an exhausting life being a bee. So keep that in mind when you're planting for them, because there's things you can do to make it easier on her. So we have other cavity nesting bees. This is a leafcutter bee. This is a small carpenter bee tunneling out this twig to lay her eggs in. One thing that's really fun about the cavity, here's what you can do in your landscape for cavity nesting bees. So anytime you have like dead trees with holes in them, if you leave those in your landscape, that's providing good nesting habitat. Brushy piles of brambles. If you're cutting your raspberries, leave a little bit of stem there, a foot or so for her to lay eggs in. Sumac is a great nesting area for these bees. You can drill extra holes into logs for them. Or you can build a bee hotel or a bee nest. So this is the UNH bee hotel that Kathy and her colleagues built at UNH. But you don't have to get that fancy. You can build something simple. So there's some sheets on the back table with instructions where if you want to build something for the native bees, how to drill the holes and what size. So this is like a great project for school kids. They can draw pictures on them. So one thing that's important, if you're creating a nesting habitat like this for bees, the whole depth is really important. The whole width is important because different species are going to nest in different sizes. So I always like to drill lots of different size holes because I don't know what's going to be in the area I want to nest here, so I want to give them lots of options. But the depth is important. Let me see if I can back this up. Here we go. So when the bee lays her eggs in this tunnel, she knows to put a couple of male eggs at the outside So often birds will come and they will peck in and they'll eat like an egg or two from the outside. And so if so the males aren't as important for building population. So if you want to grow your population, you need lots of females, but not so many males. And so when a queen mates, she stores the sperm in a compartment and she can divvy it out as needed. And that's how to lay either a male or female, depending on where she's laying it. So the important thing to know here is that if you make your hole very shallow, she's still going to put males at the outside, and so there might be room for just one or maybe no female eggs. So making those holes 5 or 6 inches deep is going to allow her room to lay female eggs, which are going to build your population. Yeah, they're fascinating, aren't they? All right. Yeah, so I brought these examples. So this is a really nice bee nest. You can buy it online. This is one that I just saw at a farm the other day, and it's filled with all these holes that are plugged. Those have bees that are going to be hatching out this spring. So this is good. Another thing to know about them, they need to have a solid back. So if the tubes go all the way through, they're not going to want to nest there. So a solid back's important. And then this is one that I also bought online, but look how shallow it is. So this one isn't going to be very effective. I mean, they're going to nest there, but it's not going to help build those populations quickly. So things to look for. All right, so a lot of the other type of bee that we have, the big category is ground nesting bees. So they live a very similar life cycle. Just instead of packing their eggs into tunnels, they're putting them underground. This is a really important species for agriculture here in the Northeast. This is a squash bee. So these pollinate all kinds of squash and cucurbits, pumpkins, cucumbers, that sort of thing. So if you go out early in the morning, these are a very early morning bee. If you're growing squash or pumpkins, and you go out in the morning and you look at the flowers, you'll often see one or maybe several of these kind of rolling around in there, getting pollen all over the place. So even at those farms that bring in honeybees, these guys come out early in the morning and they've already pollinated by the time the honeybees get there. It doesn't hurt to have the honeybees, but they can take care of the job. And you'll know you have the squash bees nesting if you see like under your squash plants, it looks like somebody stuck a pencil in the ground. That's where they're going down and laying their eggs. And even if you have like a plastic mulch in your garden, just that hole where the plant's coming out is enough and they will get their way down in their nest. A lot of our ground nesting bees are sweat bees, so there's lots of species of sweat bees. Most of them are kind of different shiny metallic colors. These are semi-communal bees, so even though it is one female laying that makes the nest herself, they often congregate in areas and have some sort of a social structure to them. And these are the kind of areas where you'll find these ground nesting bees. Anywhere where there's patchy grass or dead grass, an old dirt pile is a great place to find them. Some nest on vertical surfaces, some on flat surfaces, some in very sandy soil, some in harder packed soil. Sometimes where a tree has fallen and there's that vertical upright root system, they'll nest in there, in stone walls or bankings. So you can kind of tell, no, there's no picture. You can kind of tell a ground nesting bee hole from an ant hole because ants are constantly bringing up more sand and increasing the size of their nest, whereas the bees only do that for a very short time. So they tend to have a more weathered look and not as much fresh sand at the surface. All right, so the other type of native bee that we have a lot of here in the Northeast, which is really important, are bumblebees. So bumblebees are a native bee. There's 10 documented species historically in New Hampshire. 4 of those are either endangered or threatened or on the list of species of greatest conservation need. So these are species that we're concerned about. So these are our social native bees. So bumblebees do live in colonies, but not like honeybees. So honeybees live in perennial colonies, tens of thousands of bees in one colony, and they live year after year, not the individual bee, but the colony. They're alive and active in their hive all winter. Bumblebees are annual colonies. So the colony starts in the spring, grows through the summer, and then almost all of them die in the fall. So in the spring, right about now, you might be seeing some very large bumblebees flying around. Those are the fertilized queens of many different species that were fertilized last fall. So in the fall, some females are laid, some males are laid. They mate. The fertilized females burrow underground, each individually, and hibernates. They come out in the spring and they start foraging for pollen and nectar and looking for a place to build their nest. They like to nest in nice, warm, cushy nests, but they can't collect nest materials themselves, so they really rely on mice and rodents to build their nests for them. So any place where you would find mice and rodents nesting, you'd find bumblebees. So the mice move out, bumblebees move in. So this is somebody's lawn furniture that you can see all this mouse hair. So last year there was mice living in it. This year there's bumblebees living in it. Stone walls, hay bales, tussocks of grass, piles of brush. These are all great bumblebee habitat. So the female, this fertilized queen, she goes out and she collects pollen and nectar, and she brings it back and she starts building her little cells and laying eggs. And then once she's built up a team of workers, she stays home and lays more eggs, and the workers go out. And so as the season goes on, you'll start to see smaller bumblebees. Those are the worker bumblebees. And so the colony grows throughout the summer. There might grow to 50 or maybe a couple hundred bumblebees by the end of the season. And then they lay some males and females, they mate, everybody dies except for those fertilized females. And so they hibernate and they create all the colonies for next year. So for this to happen, not only do they need all these great nesting areas, but they need enough food, enough flowers with pollen and nectar to feed all of these developing young and to have the energy to continue to lay eggs. One thing to know about our native bees is they're not far flyers. So the flight distance of a bee is generally related to its body size. So the smallest of our native bees only fly maybe a couple hundred yards. Larger bees might fly a few miles. But generally they're staying pretty close to their nesting sites. So this is a picture of our horticulture farm at UNH in Durham, New Hampshire. So this isn't showing up here. So this is our farm, and here it is right here. So the bees that live on this farm are primarily the bees that live in the area within the farm or close to the farm. So bees aren't really going to be flying from far distances. So if you have a great pollinator garden in one spot, it's really serving the bees in the really the immediate area, not very far away. So that's why it's good to have continuous bee habitat, so that those bee populations every year they can expand and grow. Otherwise, they kind of stay in one area. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some things. If you were planting a garden for the bees, Kathy's going to talk all about planting for bees and meadows and that sort of thing. But I'm going to talk about it more from the bee perspective. Like, what qualities would you want to think about when you're planting a garden, keeping in mind the life cycle and what these bees are doing? So one thing you want to do is plant for diversity. You want to have a lot of different things in your garden. And one reason is because there's lots of different types of bees. They're different shapes and sizes. They're out at different times of the year. So the more diversity you have, the more chances that you have something that's going to match that bee. We have long-tongued bees that can drink nectar from the kind of tubular flowers. We have short-tongued bees that need only the smaller flowers. So diversity is important from that perspective, but also from a nutritional perspective. So bees, just like any of us, need that balanced diet. If they're only eating from like one or two different species, they're not getting their full complement of amino acids. They're not getting all the minerals and vitamins they need, and so they're going to be malnourished. So having lots of diversity for them is important from that nutritional side of things. You want to plant for successive flowering spring through fall. So again, there's different species that are out at different times of year, so you want to be supporting them whenever they're out. But if you think about like our bumblebees that are out for an entire season and they're building these colonies, imagine if you had lots of great plants in the fall. So your bees come out in the spring, there's not a lot for them to eat. Their population in that colony is going to grow very slowly, And then in the fall, you have a great, beautiful garden, but there's not a whole lot of bees to eat from it, and they don't have time to lay lots of eggs. If you think the other side of things, if you had like a really great spring garden, so those bees come out and they're getting lots of food, lots of nutrition, they're laying lots of eggs, building up a big population, and then come fall, you don't really have much going on for them. You have a lot of bees and not much food, so their population is going to go down, and they're not going to have a lot of queens for next year. So having lots of food all season long is how you're going to build those populations for next time. You want to plant native perennials when possible. Native because they're adapted to our native species, they co-evolve together. That doesn't mean that non-native plants aren't good for the bees. There's lots of non-native plants that are also really great pollen and nectar sources for them. Perennials because perennials just tend to have a larger source of pollen and nectar. So a lot of our annuals either don't have pollen and nectar or they don't have as much pollen and nectar. That's not to say, again, that they're bad for the bees. These are going to give you a bigger bang for your buck. You do need to have a little bit of caution when you're thinking about cultivars and plant lists. So if you're looking at a plant list for bees, there's a good chance that it's going to list this plant, Coreopsis lanceolata. This is a great bee plant. It's native to the Northeast. It's got lots of great pollen and nectar. But if you are out shopping and you see this plant, which is also, it's Coreopsis lanceolata, but this is the cultivar golden sphere, and when it has this big full flower characteristic to it, it has very little or no pollen. So within all of these petals, there aren't the anthers that you see here. And even when there are, the bees have a hard time getting to them. And so here, you can't really go by the tags, because here it's bee-friendly tag, and we know that this plant doesn't really have any pollen. So it's not dangerous, but it's not serving them that nutritional need that you might be going for. Some of our plants, like echinacea is another great bee plant. There's hundreds of cultivars. Some of them are really great bee food. Some of them don't have any pollen or nectar. And so really the best thing to do when you're thinking about what cultivars to put into your garden is go out and see what people are growing, see what the bees are feeding from. Andy Wright here in Vermont has been doing research on cultivars, comparing them to their straight species counterparts and seeing, do the bees have a preference? And what she's found is that sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So sometimes the straight species is more attractive than the cultivar. Sometimes there's no difference at all. And sometimes she's found that sometimes there's cultivars that the bees are more attracted to. So the lesson is, well, if it has this big full flower, you can be pretty confident that it's not going to have a lot of pollen for the bees. But anything that has these kind of unique ornamental characteristics, you kind of have to be watching to see what the bees are feeding from. So selecting flowers that are white, yellow, pink, blue, purple, these are the color ranges that are generally most attractive to bees. That's not to say that they won't feed from some orange or some red or other colored flowers, but in general, these are the types of colors that they're attracted to most. And plant in clusters. So think about that blue orchard bee coming out of that little tunnel, and she's going out and she's looking for 50 flowers to forage from. If you have them all spaced out throughout your yard, she's feeding a little here, and then she's flying and feeding and flying. And so it's not very efficient, and she's spending a lot of energy flying to get a full load of pollen and nectar to bring back. So if you plant in clusters, many of our bees tend to feed from just one species or one flower type per trip. And so having lots of the same thing together is going to be more attractive to them, and it's going to help them with that efficiency and not spending as much time flying. They can spend more of their energy laying eggs, which is what we want them to do. And just thinking about making sure that the flowering habitat is close to the nesting habitat. So you want to minimize the distance that those bees are flying. So if you can have nesting habitat and flowering habitat all mingled together, that's really going to be a good benefit for those bees. All right, so I'm going to pass things over to Kathy so she can talk more about the actual planting. And we'll do questions at the end.
Okay, we've gotten to the point where we know we want to attract bees and we need to provide habitat for the bees to live in. And now we need to plant some pollinator gardens. We need to have pollinator gardens and pollinator flowers available. And to speak about this, we have Kathy Neal. She is a professor, specialist in nursery and landscaping horticulture at the Extension Service in UNH. She has her master's and PhD degrees in horticulture from the Cornell University. And her role at the Extension is to develop and conduct educational programs for nursery and landscape professionals. Is that true? In addition to promoting beautiful landscapes, her current focus is on the creation and maintenance of sustainable landscapes. These landscapes provide essential ecological services such as water runoff management, wildlife habitat, biodiversity, organic waste recycling, and protection of soil and water quality, and most importantly, for her talk today, habitat for native pollinators. Kathy?
Thanks, Ed. It's amazing what you can find on the internet, isn't it? I'm always relieved when they haven't dredged up any secrets from my past. So we're going to talk more about the plants in this segment. Amy has set the stage well, and I'm sure you're all very enthused and ready to go create pollinator habitat now. But it isn't quite as easy as maybe it sounds so far. So I'm going to talk about some of the research and experiences I've had since 2009 when I started planting some mixed meadows. That was back before everybody got excited about pollinators. So we really were looking at meadow establishment from a different standpoint and for all the other ecological services that it can provide. But a couple years later, everybody thought pollinators were, in danger and the interest grew greatly in creating habitat for them. And I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and I've already started down this road. So these are, and a lot of the pictures that Amy showed you are from our plots and research at the UNH Research Farm, which is in Durham. And at the end of the program, I'll invite you to come out there in a couple of months for pollinator appreciation. So Amy set the stage well to tell you what bees need. Basically, they need, places to nest. They need safe habitat, and that safe habitat really should be warm and sunny places that are not subject to a lot of disturbance. So you don't want to create habitat where, it's going to be mowed up frequently or the ground is going to be disturbed frequently, such as tilling and things like that. They're going to be happier if they aren't disturbed. And also, of course, you want to put the habitat in a place where it's not going to be exposed to pesticide drift from your own or your neighbor's uses or the roadside or whatever. So just a few things to think about in terms of whether you're going to build a bee hotel or plant habitat for them. And since we're really talking about providing floral resources, because that's what bees eat, we're talking about both flowers for pollen and flowers for nectar. And we have lots of really pretty flowers and pretty pictures to show you. And fortunately, the bees appreciate those flowers as well. So when bees come out this time of year, there isn't an awful lot in bloom when they're out looking for things. Primarily, they're going to be looking for those early blooming spring flowering trees and shrubs in this area of the country. That's going to be their primary source of pollen and nectar at this time. So as the weatherman is telling us that it's allergy season and the pollen counts are rising and everything like that, that's good news for the bees. And they're pretty much tied into the seasonality as things get warm. I saw my first bumblebee the other day this weekend. So they are starting to come out. So on the left, I just have a picture of a few of our native shrubs that you probably are familiar with. Pussy willow and other willows are really excellent spring pollen and nectar sources for all types of bees, including honeybees and also the native bees. A little further down, and I think the pussy willows are some of the, really the first ones that are out there. And so if you have pussy willows, of course, if you cook them, that kind of destroys the purpose of providing pollinator habitat, but they do make nice cut things for your vase. But you know, when you cut them before they turn yellow. When they turn yellow, it means that the anthers are out and the pollen is being dispersed, and that's when you're going to look at them and find the bees are just really, really attracted and active on them. But we have other native shrubs that will come out a little bit later. There's a viburnum, this is viburnum trilobum here, and then in the midsummer we've got our one native rose, Rosa virginiana, and those things will always, you know, be pollinator magnets. And it's not just bees. I mean, we're focusing on bees here today, but we're also, you know, talking about flies and beetles and birds and bats and hummingbirds. Although they each have their own way of selecting what they're going to feed on. So that's why we kind of are focusing on bees, because we can't cover everything in a short talk here. Besides, that's what most people are interested in. For summer, though, really, you know, it's when these perennials come into bloom, either in natural areas, in fields, in woods edges, on farms and so forth, that those perennial wildflowers, be they planted or what some may consider weeds, those are the primary food sources at that time. Now, not all of their food sources, or not all their preferred food sources, are going to be native. And in one study last summer that the Bee Lab did at UNH, and they were analyzing all the plant pollinator interactions on the farm where we worked, and white clover was the #1 plant that supported the most pollinator activity, both in terms of abundance and diversity of pollinators. White clover is not a native species, right? But it doesn't mean that it can't provide nutrition and habitat for bees. So I thought it might be good just to address this question up front, because it always comes up and it's always in all the articles and so forth about the importance of native plants for bees. And certainly, you know, all native bees and native plants have a long history of coevolution with each other, and so that's strong evidence that there would be interdependence on each other. But only about 15% of our native bees are specialist bees. In other words, those would be types of bees that would only feed on one genus, or more likely one family of plants. The other 85% are what we call generalist feeders. And so they're like us. They like to eat a variety of a lot of different things. And by eating a lot of different things, they can meet their nutritional needs. And so it's a lot less important to them that these be native plants that they've evolved with, as long as they can eat enough varied diet that they get those basic amino acids and lipids and sugars that they need to survive. You also have to realize that most of our agricultural crops are not native species, and so we're asking these native bees to pollinate them, but then we say, oh, we want to only plant native plants for the pollinators, but that's kind of a contradictory statement there. And really in the agricultural and urban environments, the dependence of many bees is very heavily on non-native species such as the white clover, the dandelions in your lawn or your field edges, alfalfa when it grows into bloom, and buckwheat is a wonderful bee plant, but all those are non-native plants. So, you know, that's kind of the bottom line, is that these are opportunists, most of them, except for that 15%, are going to feed on whatever is out there that's available and meets their nutritional needs. There have been a number of studies where, you know, there's been some control and experiment and analysis of the bee preferences for native versus non-native plants, and you know, it comes out slightly in favor that the bees feed more on native plants, but there's no generalization that we can say that non-native plants are bad for bees. And are there any beekeepers here? Okay, there are. So honeybees are very, very fond of some non-natives. In fact, they're very, very fond of some invasives, right? And I think Japanese knotweed is one I've heard beekeepers tell me that, you know, they would hate to cut down the Japanese knotweed because it's a great nectar source for those honeybees. So I'm not defending invasive plants. I'm just making the point that we can't oversimplify things and just say that we can only plant native plants for native bees, okay? All right, so I think Amy's already covered all of this, but what we're trying to achieve when we are creating a perennial wildflower meadow is a dense and diverse mixture of wildflowers and grasses. Now, bees don't feed on grass pollen, right? Grass is basically wind-pollinated, self-pollinated, and it doesn't need bees. It's one of those things that evolved without pollination services being required by bees. So primarily, we're putting grass in there for space in between the wildflowers and for other habitat, great place for rodents, which means a great place for bumblebees, right? You got that connection now, and we can't be too selective and say, well, we're going to plant these beautiful gardens and meadows, but we only want bees to come. We don't want rodents. We don't want woodchucks. We don't want deer. The ecology doesn't work that way. Everything is connected. Having said everything I've said about natives and non-natives, I do err on the side of caution when planting wildflower meadows and use only native perennial wildflowers in my mixes. It's not because I think they're better for the bees, it's because I don't want to be introducing or planting things that are going to escape and disrupt the ecosystem in unforeseen ways. So I think there are enough native wildflower perennials that we can draw on that's a perfectly fine way to do it. When we start to talk about gardens, then we're more apt to be introducing non-native species, but we have more control over those. And many of these wildflowers do freely self-seed and will come up wherever they can find their space to come up. We have to give a little shout out here to the roots, okay? We always look at the tops of plants and the flowers and how beautiful they are, but the reason they can do that and the reason they can come up year after year and become a really sustainable and semi-permanent community, plant community, is because of their amazing and diverse root systems. So just like different plants have different size and shape tops, they have different morphological patterns to their roots, and it all knits together to make a wonderful underground network that's very good for healthy soils, it's very good for stormwater filtration, it's very good for maintaining the organic matter in the soil as the roots get recycled and feed the organic microbes in the soil. So the roots deserve at least a little attention on one slide. All right, so now if you want to do this, if you want to do a meadow, which is what I just showed you, it's not really just a question of stopping mowing your lawn. It's not really a question of not mowing your pasture so much. Most of our native wildflowers are not going to be competitive against those pasture grasses and lawn grasses, which are non-native, by the way. But they have very thick and rhizomatous root systems that even those very strong wildflower root systems are not going to be able to establish and fight off and suppress those weeds. So to get from this, which is what I started with in that first meadow, and it's basically a mowed area that's never been really fertilized or maintained as a lawn, it's just a mowed turf. To get from there to there, that's what I want to kind of take you through a series of how-tos at this point. And it's not that easy. I'm sure everyone here probably has been handed a packet of seeds by now to plant a bee garden. Either at a trade show, a home show, you know, your local garden center, whatever. And the intentions are good, and I really appreciate that. But I think it can backfire in a way because it implies all you need to do is take this nice packet of seeds and sprinkle it out over this grassy area and everything will come up lovely and be nice, right? But if you look at what's in those seeds, many of them are annual flowers. Most of them are Mediterranean flowers. They do really well in California, but they're not really very well suited for here. There's a few perennials thrown in there, which would give you hope. But you seed perennials into grass, and what's going to happen? You're going to end up with grass. So, what you need to do first is pick a good site and then prepare it well. Okay, so we already talked about this, but one common question I get is how big do I have to, have a spot to put a meadow like this? Keep in mind that these native perennial wildflower species are tall. This is not like knee-high meadow. This is 4 or 5 foot tall meadow. Okay, so you don't want to put it like in front of your front window maybe. If you want to put it out in the back 40 where you have a view from a distance, it also does end up with, holes in it. It's not even like a hedge, it's, spotty. There are times of the year when it may not look really well. So it's best to put it a little bit distant maybe from your main traffic area. And I always say as a minimum probably 20 by 20 or 400 square feet. It doesn't have to be square, is a good minimum size that you'll have enough room to get a good diversity of species growing in there and for them to stand up against each other and help hold each other up. It's okay if the soil's poor. In fact, it probably favors these types of plants over the grasses and over weeds if the soil is somewhat poor. So we don't fertilize these things. I've never put fertilizer on any of these plots, and that probably favors those wildflowers over especially the grassy weeds, which would respond really well to fertilizer. You need to spend the first season preparing your site. So although you may leave here tonight thinking, oh, I'm going to plant this beautiful meadow, the best thing you can do is to identify your site and then spend the summer killing what's there already, okay? Especially if it's grassy. Because you have a huge weed seed bank on that site. And you also, if you're starting with grasses, have all those rhizomatous roots that will continue to sprout and regrow for quite a while. So we don't want to plant our seeds into that. We want to create a good planting bed, first of all. So there are various ways that you can do that, and it depends on your size, your equipment, your ability, your desire to be organic, or your desire to do it the easiest way. Okay, so the easiest way probably is to spray it with a non-selective herbicide. And a lot of people don't want to do that, and that's fine. I'm just throwing the options out there. But consider that if we're spraying that on this mowed grassy area, there are no flowers present. There's nothing there that really is being directly sprayed by that's going to be adversely affected by it, except the vegetation. That's what we're doing.
And water.
Pardon?
Some of those herbicides are not going away. They're going to be.
Okay, we're not going to get into that discussion because we could spend the whole next hour doing that. Like I say, it's your choice. It is legal and it is approved by the EPA and it is available, and I am telling you what the options are. So that's a good, effective, I don't mean good, I mean effective way to do it. The other way that I frequently use is to cover where I want to plant with a good 6 milliliter black plastic, okay? And 6 mil is good because as deer or dogs walk across it, it doesn't poke holes in it so easily, otherwise you lose the effectiveness. But what we're doing with black plastic is we're excluding light. Okay, so as seeds come up or root pieces send up new leaves, it can't get any light, that plant's going to die. And after a while, it runs out of energy, and you run through these cycles, and you've depleted some of the possibility of these things coming up. So that's a really good method. Some people don't like the look of black plastic, and some people, again, don't want to use plastic because it's a oil-based product. That's, again, your choice. If you just don't like the looks, you could then sprinkle an organic mulch over the top of it, just to kind of hide it during the summer. Other people have used like layers of cardboard and straw and things like that. So whatever you can do to exclude light from seeds and roots that are coming up is fine. The other thing you hear a lot about is solarization, which is the use of black or clear plastic, which is allowing the UV light to penetrate, and then it traps it as heat in the soil, and so it heats the soil up and can kill wheat seeds. But all the work that's been done on solarization really has been done in like southwestern United States and Israel and places that have really quite hot and very intense sunlight and not a lot of rainfall. So I have had some plots out to compare the soil temperatures at different depths under the clear and the black plastic and so forth. And at this point, I'm not recommending the solarization as a reliable way to really get great kill of weed seeds. So it will kill some species in the top inch or so, but depending on how deep down the weeds are coming from, it may not be your best choice. So needs more work in that. The other thing we've tried is just repeated tillage. So just as the weeds come up, to go through and till them under, let them regrow, till them under, and this would take like 3 or 4 times during the summer. But that, like everything else, has got its advantages and disadvantages. Okay, you're using energy, you're using a machine, you're using gasoline. And every time you till, you're bringing up new weed seeds. Okay. And you're exposing the underlying soil to air, which is resulting in more carbon depletion of the soil. So there are some real advantages to a no-till system, which would bring us back to either that or that. Because once you've had your black plastic down all season and you pull that up, you basically have the planting bed ready to seed, and you don't ever need to till that to plant seeds. So you can plant either then in the fall after you've had your black plastic down or tilled all summer or whatever. Or you can wait then and plant the following spring as early as you can get in there. So these wildflower seeds, a lot of them are enhanced by exposure to cold. And so planting them in the fall is perfect because then they're exposed to the cold all winter, and they are coming up now in last fall's planted plots. They're very happy being planted in the fall. The only danger is if you're, on a slope or you stand to have seeds washed from rainfall, or the birds are going to come eat them or something like that. Because these seeds are very, very small for the most part, and they need to be left right on the surface or no more than 1/8 of an inch in the ground. So they're pretty much surface applied, which is why we can do it by hand. This is me just sprinkling some seeds in this plot that I was establishing here. One trick of the trade is to mix your seeds with moist vermiculite or moist sawdust, or I've even heard people using kitty litter. And what you're doing is sticking those tiny little seeds to the larger particles, and that way when you're sprinkling them out, you can see where you're going and get good even distribution. It's very hard to take a very small quantity of very small seeds and distribute them evenly. Once you have put the seeds out, just raking them in, this is Amy, raking them in very, very lightly with a hand rake, so you're not burying them, but just working them into the soil a little bit, and or rolling them is a good practice. So either like a lawn roller, like if you just seeded your lawn, or this is a farm implement called a cultipacker. It's just a roller with little nubs on it. It's just putting some pressure on it to get good soil to seed contact, which is important. And then we would put a little clean straw over the top of that just to protect it, especially in a fall planting. Uh-oh. So we did everything right, and a couple months later, say we planted in the spring, this is July. Nobody's gonna like this, right? And you've got some Rudbeckia black-eyed Susan in there. That's basically the only thing in these mixes that's gonna give you flowers the first year. Everything else is gonna come up and germinate and grow as a very small, short, green, vegetative plant the first year. So the first thing to do is manage your expectations, or your client's expectations if you're doing it for someone. Tell them the first year it's probably not gonna look very good. We can come in and mow it in midsummer, just to tidy it up, and we'll mow high, like 4 to 6 inches above ground, because most of those small little wildflowers are going to be shorter than that. We are cutting the rudbeckias, but they'll come right back into bloom, and it's just gonna make it look much more palatable to most people. So again, you might not want that in your front yard, right? Yeah. If you don't have those big tall field weeds, you probably got crabgrass. Anybody have crabgrass? So this can be really, really devastating to these small little seedlings that are coming up, and they get just smothered with this crabgrass. So again, there are some options to control that, but at the very least, you would want to mow that before it goes to seed. Otherwise, you're just seeding the crabgrass over and over again. And by mowing it, you're also opening it up a little bit to more light to get down where those wildflowers are. But crabgrass can be a real problem. If you can get through this first year, however, these are the same plots here. This is the next year. Okay, so these are mostly now what? Susan's rudbeckias, okay? So they're going to be your early indicator of success. Okay, they won't last past the second or third year because the other things that took a lot longer to come in are now going to come up and be much more competitive. These are not black-eyed Susans here. This is upright prairie coneflower and Heliopsis or perennial sunflower, and here's your Monarda coming in here. So that's same plots, first year, second year, third year over here. This meadow on the right side is actually 1 year older than the ones on the left, so that's the difference a year makes. But I always tell everybody establishing a meadow is a 3-year process. First year, especially prepare the soil. Second year, expect it to look bad. Third year, you start to get at least the look of a meadow. And then the fourth year is when it really is going to come into its own, and you're going to see more diversity coming in. You're going to see some of the beautiful wildflowers and grasses that you've planted, like this wild rye here. And a year later, then we've got more of the slower species such as goldenrods and echinaceas coming up. I do have, I have selected over the past several years those plants that seem to be the most reliable and put this together in a list. I mean, you can go to wildflower seed companies and find all kinds of different mixes. Most of them will have like 19 to 25 different species of wildflowers and 4 or 5 species of grasses in them, and you plant them out there, and you won't get more than half the species actually coming up, but it's a shotgun approach. Well, you're spending a lot of money. That seed is not cheap. This seed mix that I've put together here, you can order the seeds individually and weigh them out by percentages to make a mix, and it'll run you about $5 to $6 per 100 square feet just for the seeds. So as you get bigger, of course, that gets pretty expensive, but the other mixes are going to be even more. And these are the ones I found to be reliable, at least in our area of New Hampshire. This list is available on the website, which I'll show you in a bit. I also have a limited number of copies with me, so if you'd like that at the end, I'd be glad to share that with you. The other thing you could do, if you don't want to mess with a year of site preparation and then a year of not looking good, is to start with plugs or transplants. So plugs are just really small transplants. They're seeded right in small cell trays, which is what you see over here, and then you can just take those out and put them in. I suggest a grid of about 2 by 2 feet, so 1 plant per square feet. But that's going to run you 6 or 8 times more money than starting with the seeds. You can use the same species selection basically and more, because since you're planting these plants that are already up and growing, they stand a lot better chance against the weeds, and so your establishment rate is greater, and you can get some things to establish from plugs that will not be very successful from seed. You also will have the advantage of some of them flowering the first or second year besides the black-eyed Susan, because some of them say the seed company started them in the plugs last year. They went through the winter, they got their cold exposure. They come up there already a year ahead of what you might get if you were seeding. So Amy mentioned that we want to provide these with food choices from early through late season. And this is the phenology chart, and the way you use this is basically a calendar across the top, starting with the first week of May, so each square represents a week during the growing season. This is in Durham time. And then the species, which I know you can't read, but again, this is available. In fact, in the handout that was over on that table called Planting for Pollinators, this chart is in there. So what you want to do is make sure that you have at least 3 species in bloom early in the spring, at least probably 6 or 7 species for summer, and then at least 3 species for fall, so that you're providing that diversity of food sources year long. And so our biggest challenge is to get things that bloom early in the spring. This top one is Golden Alexander, or Zizia. It's related to carrots, so it looks like a carrot gone into bloom. It's really pretty. There it is right there. Isn't that nice? And guess what? Flowers at the same time as lupins do, and so they make a really great combination to give you that May bloom. And they'll appeal to different pollinators, because look at the difference in the flower form here. These are really open and very accessible to even tiny bees, whereas the lupin flowers have those lips on them, and it takes something big and strong like a bumblebee to pry its way in there and to use that for a food source. In June, we still are, not at a peak. This is an established meadow. Here's the lanceleaf coreopsis, come from seed, and here's penstemon, foxglove. There's a bumblebee. And they're so fun to watch in this, because they have to burrow their way right into that flower to get down there where the nectar sources are. Midsummer becomes much more photogenic, so we have all this diversity, and not only diversity in flowers, but now diversity in the pollinators, and we'll see the clear-winged hummingbird moths out there, and the first time people see them, they always get really excited. They think they're hummingbirds, but we also have hummingbirds come and feed on things like the monarda and some of the red-flowered species. But again, most of these are in that yellow, purple, white palette, because that's what bees see. They don't see the red. They can't distinguish that from green. So the red flowers like cardinal flower or columbine are mainly evolved to be attractive to hummingbirds and or butterflies. If you have a wet meadow, you would use slightly different species mix, but Joe Pyeweed is wonderful in the wet meadow, and then this purpley one right in front of it is blue vervain, Verbena hustata. So there are choices for wet as well. There are a number of goldenrods, and most people have an aversion to goldenrod because you think of the Canada goldenrod, which can be a real thug and really spread very aggressively and outcompete other things. But there are probably 5 or 6 different goldenrods that we've used, including, this is probably a showy goldenrod, Solidago speciosa. There's an Ohio goldenrod, there's a stiff goldenrod, and they're all very well behaved compared to the Canada goldenrod. Goldenrod in the research studies is the plant that supports the most pollinators. The most numbers of bee species, the most bees. It's the #1 thing probably that you could plant for supporting bees in this area. And then the New England aster is also a very important fall food source for the bees. And of course the goldenrod will go out and go by, and we'll still have New England aster in the flower until we get a really hard freeze in November. So at that time, you go out on a nice warm sunny day, and that's where all the bumblebees are. They're trying to get the last of the food before they go underground for the winter, and they depend on New England aster for that. And don't forget the grasses. Again, it's not so much because anybody's going to feed on that in terms of the pollinators, but because it adds a component to the meadow that's important for other reasons. And many of the bees do like to nest at the base of those clumpy type grasses. Now these grasses that we're planting are warm season grasses, so they're clump type grasses. They're not the cool season perennial rhizomatous grasses that I disparaged earlier in the talk. So things like little blue stem and Indian grass is what I'm talking about now. In terms of meadow maintenance, I talked about that midsummer mowing in the first year after it's planted. After that, your maintenance becomes really, really easy. It's one, look for obnoxious weeds and especially invasives and try to, what I do is just clip them down to the ground every time I see a bittersweet vine or a purple loosestrife coming up or something like that. And, you know, but the birds do bring those in, so it's always going to be a constant battle. And we also mow about every other year. And that's the best way to maintain the most value for ground nesting birds and small mammals and other wildlife besides the pollinators is not to mow it every year. And that's the temptation a lot of people have is as soon as it's done flowering in the fall, they want to go in there and mow it down because it starts to look a little bit ratty in the late fall. But if you can stand that and leave it standing, you'll be rewarded with tons of birds in the late fall that are come in and collect seeds from all those standing wildflower heads. So it's really worth leaving there. And then you can come in either late, like November or early December, or early the next spring, except I haven't had much luck there because it's usually too wet or there's still snow on the ground this time of year, and it's really hard to get in there and get it mowed before stuff starts coming up. But the bottom picture is after mowing, and you can just leave that debris lay there to decompose and to reseed and to provide habitat. And it doesn't look like anything at that point. But the next spring, it's going to bounce right back up, and you'll be amazed at how quickly those plants come back. And from then on, it's once you're to that point, you have what I consider a sustainable meadow, spring, summer, fall. And even winter. I want to just quickly bring the bees back in. This is just a little video. I just want you to watch it and start to notice how many bees you really do see in just this little patch of wildflowers. If you pick a bee and kind of follow it, you'll see an example of what's called flower constancy. So usually a bee will go out and decide, well, I'm going to eat Monarda today. You know, we'll go from Monarda to Monarda. It won't get distracted by the upright prairie coneflower or whatever along the way. But the next day, maybe it's going to come out and eat something else, and a different, bee of either the same or a different species might choose something else. Honeybees are very different, however, because the initial scouts that go out decide what everybody's going to eat that day, and then they go back and tell them where to go and what to eat, right? But these solitary bees and bumblebees really need to make their own decisions. They don't have anybody telling them. And different bees do prefer different things. This is just a little snippet of data that I've had some students out there, and we use a hoop and stand there and do timed counts and record the number and types of bees that come in and feed on those types of flowers and move on through the field for the afternoon. And the height of the bars is the total number of average bees per 5 minutes that visited those. But the colors represent different types of bees. So blue is bumblebees and green is honeybees. And I think the point of this graph is that, honeybees really like this plant and they like that plant and that plant, but they didn't like this one or that one. And other bees have different preferences. So, while we tend to generalize and say that all bees like, these flowers, different bees are going to have the ability to pick and choose as long as we provide that diversity. So just to wrap up, because I know some people might not think that kind of wild and woolly type of a meadow is for them. Maybe you have a small space or whatever, it doesn't mean you can't provide some food for pollinators. And so in terms of a garden, now we're talking about individual plants, and we're talking about being successful in placing and cultivating individual plants. Whereas in the meadow, we're talking about success of a species over time, being able to survive and reproduce and establish itself in this plant community. Okay, here we're talking about more individual plants, so we can use that to our advantages as humans because we have a design element that we can impose on that and get really nice combinations of plants, and we can be successful with some species that may not have been successful in that very competitive meadow environment. If you only have a container, you can choose something that's very attractive to bees, okay? So as long as you can get a good plant that, you know, hadn't been exposed to neonicotinoids or pesticides in its lifetime before you bring it home, you can certainly do good things with even small spaces. If you plant a pollinator garden, though, it's probably going to look more like this than, you know, it's not going to be your 10-inch tall garden of annuals. Usually it's going to still be based on perennials with some annuals and herbs interspersed perhaps, but you can create and design very, very nice gardens, and some will have a more natural type look to them than others do. This is down at Elm Bank, Mass Hort Society down in Massachusetts, right in front of their building. So this is becoming more and more popular, and you can, you know, discover these really, really nice plant combinations. I just think it's really fun to see how these plants complement and grow along with each other, and the grasses. Here's some cardinal flower, which didn't last long in the meadow because everything else outcompeted it, but you can put it in a garden in a space with less competition and be successful with that. We can't forget the monarchs. Everybody wants to grow milkweeds for monarchs, so I just want to tell you really quickly the 3 species of milkweeds that you can grow in New Hampshire. One I'm sure you're familiar with, just the common milkweed that you see sprouting up in old fields and so forth. It's a great pollinator plant, not just for milkweeds, but it's often covered with bumblebees and honeybees whenever it's in bloom, and it's very fragrant. The problem with it is it does have runners, and it doesn't tend to stay where you want it, so it's not a great garden plant. Butterfly weed is a much nicer garden plant because it will pretty much stay where you put it. It likes dry soils, it likes poor soils, low fertility, that's where it's going to thrive. It did not do well in the meadow mix because it wasn't very competitive, except way down at the end of my plots where I have some really poorer soil, and a lot of the grasses did well there, and the butterfly weed and my one lupin in one set of plots came up down there. So those are the ones, if you've got really poor sandy soil, to put them there or put them in a garden situation. That's what it looks, the pods after the flowers go by, very attractive. And then the third one that people are less familiar with is red milkweed or swamp milkweed. Nobody wants to call it that because that sounds horrible, but it might give you a clue that it's going to do better in a wetter area. And it also will, all of these will support monarchs in terms of being host plants for the larvae. Most of the other nectar plants in the meadow we see monarchs on when they're late in the season when the monarchs come. Not that we've had a lot of monarchs, but they will take nectar from things like the monarda, the vernonia, and things like that. It's just that they can't lay their eggs on those, and the larvae can't survive on them, so you do need milkweed for that to occur. Back to the non-native bulbs in the spring. Often you'll find these on crocuses and the blue scilla that probably is coming up right now in lawns and so forth. Those are good pollen sources early in the spring when there aren't a lot of other things around. A word about annuals, okay? So annuals are not generally considered to be really good pollinator plants. Think about, do we have any native annuals around here? Most of them are, we have a lot of annual weeds, right? And those are generally good flowers for pollinators, but most of the annuals that are in our bedding plants in our gardens come from other places, and the ones that tend to be good for pollinators tend to be the Mediterranean derived ones, but these are kind of like the plants Amy was talking about. They've gone through so much genetic manipulation to create new colors, new forms, new this, new that. I think inadvertently there's a good chance that they've also had some changes happening along the way that could change their attractiveness to pollinators if they ever were in the first place. There are a few that are reliable. Sweet alyssum is good, cleome or spider flower, and sunflowers, okay? Annual sunflowers. But you know what the breeders are doing now is they're creating pollenless sunflowers so that they don't make a mess when we use them as a cut flower and bring them inside. So you just have to be careful and know these things when you go shop for these plants. Herbs are wonderful, okay, if you let them go into flower, which often we don't want them to if we're using them for culinary use, but borage is a bee favorite. Basil, chives, lavender, oregano, those Mediterranean type herbs are very, very attractive, and you can intersperse them with your vegetables. So we're starting to see a lot of things come out with names like Be Bright, Be Alive, Be Friendly, Be Good. So they're very trendy, and you'll see a lot of these things, but we don't have any evidence that they live up to their name. We're just taking the seed company's recommendation on that. So this may be, you know, what some people want, and that's okay. But if they think they're planting a pollinator garden and they're going heavily annuals and grasses, then that's probably not the end result that they're going to get. So these are just repeats here. I think the first thing you need to do is tolerate a little bit of mess and be a little less neat and tidy. Allow for some dead stems, some wood debris, some, you know, clumps of grasses and so forth. And also look for those plants that are good. We don't have time to talk about the lawn thing here, but whenever you can, just encouraging diversity, I think. The more diverse flowering plants you have, the better chances that they're going to be there for some pollinators that will appreciate them. So that's our website, extension.unh.edu, and you can search for Wildflower Meadows and come up with this page, which has a number of the fact sheets and all on it. And then these are some other really good resources here. If you have an interest in citizen science and want to do some pollinator monitoring, this ratesunflower.org, although they're in California, they're collecting data from all over the country on bee counts and what flowers you see them on, so that's a good thing to contribute to. And here's your official invitation to come to Durham on June 19th at 3 o'clock, and we'll be giving field tours of these plots, and also Sandra Rehan, the bee lab, will be there with lots of displays and talk about the native bees of New Hampshire. So that's the end.
We have time for some questions. Since we only have one microphone that seems to be working well, I'm going to leave the microphone with Amy and Kathy up here, and if you could speak up loudly, I'll choose who's going to speak, and I'm pointing at you, and Amy and Kathy will decide who's going to answer the question. Okay, is that right? So, I had a question. If you create a small 400 square feet pollinator garden, and it's in a grass area, would it be good to be maintaining the perimeter of that outside the pollinator garden itself to keep the grasses and the weeds and everything from flowering in that area? So that you don't get the creeping of the native weeds.
So once you've gotten to that third year, that meadow is very resistant to a lot of, other than the invasives, there's not a lot that's going to be competitive against it. During the first year, probably the second year, you would want to keep other things from being able to reseed, but particularly, woody things we're gonna control by mowing. Wherever you have bare ground, it's open season, so that's where your competition is going to occur.
So, questions? Yes.
How do you differentiate between what you're referring to as weeds and all the other stuff that grows in flowers? Many of the things you talked about as the perennials that are good for the pollinators are what a lot of people call weeds.
Yes, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? So it's, a lot of it's what you call them, but if you're asking how you recognize them individually, on our webpage, we do have a guide to identifying seedlings, so that you would hopefully be able to use that to identify which things are coming up that are good things that you want to keep, and then other things that you don't want to keep.
Can you give an example of the other things that you don't want to keep?
Well, primarily crabgrass would be a great example. The thing is that once you start pulling individual weeds, once you seeded this, you're creating a lot of disturbance and opening it up for more weeds to come in. So a lot of that first year is just tolerating what's there and then mowing it down.
Yes.
Yeah, so I've always heard that it's not good to plant grasses with your wildflowers when you're initially seeding, because the grasses sort of end up in there anyway. Are there certain grasses that you recommend planting with that mix?
Yes, so the grasses that we're planting are the clump-forming, warm-season grasses, things that you would find in a Midwestern prairie, like little blue stem, Indian grass, also wild rye. Canadian wild rye is very nice. So what you don't want to plant is things that are going to be competitive, like lawn grasses. So you don't want to plant Kentucky bluegrass. We've even done some trials planting fescues in the meadows, and they've been too competitive for the wildflowers, although they look nice together. But yeah.
Yes. Good deal. Yes, sir.
Do solitary bees use their chambers over and over year after year?
Yeah, not the same bee because that bee died, but the next generation will be looking for cavities, and so they very well could use that same cavity. You might also get solitary wasps using the cavity or other insects. But yeah, so like if you build a bee hotel in the spring or whenever that species hatches out, there's empty cavities, different bees will come and move in, absolutely.
If bees nest under my squashes and I cultivate next spring, have I totally devastated them?
Yeah, so the squash bees nest where the squash are growing. They nest about 8 to 12 inches below the surface. So different species of ground nesting bees will nest at different depths. Squash bees in particular are about 8 to 12 inches down. So if you till shallowly, just a few inches, they'll be fine. If you till more like 6 to 8 inches down, you might not hit the nest, but you'll be disrupting the soil above the nest enough that those, when they hatch, they can't a lot of times find their way back up. So deep tilling, and of course you'll hit the nest. So yeah, if you're growing squash and you've got squash bees nesting, it's good to do no-till or a very shallow till.
Yes.
Soil depth for a meadow, we have a lot of rock very close to the surface because of everybody around here. So
The farm where I have these lots, I mean, for years they had students picking rocks all the time. It's like, this is a hopeless task, but you have to have enough depth that there's going to be some moisture reserve there, because you saw the roots on these. They want to grow deep. If they can't grow deep, then they're not going to tolerate a summer like last summer when we had a real drought. So you want to have, soil depth, but if you just have occasional rocks, I think the key is just to plant around them and expect that you'll have some rocks sticking up.
Yes, sir.
Could you answer the questions that are written on that pad, please?
Yeah, I will. We've got some questions that I think have been discussed, but how about ticks in pollinator gardens?
Okay, you answer that one.
All right, this is a question that always comes up, and people have a valid concern that we're creating these tall, dense, vegetative areas, which could be tick habitat, and that's true. So we can't say that we're only gonna let the pollinators use this and ticks aren't allowed. And especially, because the mammals that carry ticks, the mice and the deers, are apt to be traveling through the meadow and maybe bringing them to the site, and then they will survive as long as there's that nice moist vegetation. And that's really the key to the tick life cycle in the summer, is that moist, tall vegetation. I've talked with Alan Eaton, who some of you heard a couple weeks ago speak here, and we just have to say that it can create tick habitat. That said, I have had more ticks exposure in my home garden than I've ever had ticks, maybe 2, and I spend a lot of time out there. So I think there is a value in diversity that we don't quite fully understand yet. And the other thing, recommendation, if you're doing a large-scale meadow, is to keep it mowed around it, and if you have a really field-type meadow, to keep wide paths mowed through it so that you can walk through it and people can enjoy it without brushing up against those plants, because the ticks aren't able to fly or jump very far. So if you can stay on that nice short mowed grassy area, and you can't walk through these 4 or 5 foot tall clumps of plants anyway, then you're kind of protecting yourself that way.
I want to do another question from this chart, which people ask questions on the internet. One that I was going to ask myself, and what about trees, the pollinating trees? 40 years ago, I have a farm up in Hanover Center, and 40 years ago, I planted a little linden tree for my German wife. Very common in her landscape around her house, and it was to give her some memory of what it was like back home. And now that tree is really mature. And in June, when it flowers, the flowers are really small, you don't hardly see them, but it's a crescendo of bee activity. And in fact, if I'm just waking up in the morning and the window's open, I can hear it. That'll get me awake. Can you say something about pollinated trees? Orchards?
Yeah, so lots of the trees that you might plant in the landscape for ornamental plants, the bees are attracted to. Some crab apples, not all of them, because some of them, like we both said, once they've been bred for ornamental characteristics, sometimes they lose that bee value. But lots of our fruit trees, any kind of flowering ornamental trees are often good pollinator plants. Even our maple trees that are blooming now, even though they are wind pollinated, they have great pollen nectar, so that's a really important early spring food source for the bees. Yeah, I don't know. Any other important trees? Locust, yeah. Locust has a really high nectar flow, really important for the bees. Willows are a really important spring food source for the bees. Serviceberry. Any others to think of? Yes. So yeah, definitely trees and shrubs, weeds, dandelions.
Okay. There's a question about mowing, but I think that we've already addressed when to mow a pollinator garden. Did you have one that mentioned that question?
Another question about, how can you tell if your goldenrod is Canadian?
They're polite.
Try not to make a joke. I guess you just need to get like a weed identification book, or go online and look up Canada goldenrod, and chances are it probably is if it's just out there and you didn't
Bees like
plant
it, it's just,
Bees like it, it's just people don't like it so much. And it does become very competitive. It's not considered an invasive, it's not on the state prohibited invasive list, but you know, it can kind of take over in these meadow situations. I think it would decrease the diversity of what is allowed to grow there.
Yes, sir.
Okay to let your chickens free range out there?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's lots of things that eat bees, and that's fine. That's one of the functions of bees, is to be food for other creatures, whether it's chickens or wild creatures. So, yeah, they will pick them off and eat them. So, yeah, they can fly away.
Barbara?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, before, while they last, there's a sign-up sheet here for people who plan to grow a pollinator garden. Just fill this in. I have one full sheet already. And if you sign up before they disappear, you can have a baby native bee balm. Not very big yet. It's ready to be transplanted. Probably not ready to go outside. The other thing is that make sure you know what to look for in garden centers about neonicotinoids. If you don't have this brochure, there's a chart inside of the things you might find in garden centers. We've got to do something about this chemical that is really affecting bees. There's no question. It's part of the decline. And I have a few single sheets about butterfly weed with a butterfly weed seed on them. And so if you don't get one of these plants,
Yes.
yes, but I do want you to think about growing a pollinator garden. How will we know if we're successful in increasing the number of pollinators? How can we keep a track of that? And so I would like you to be thinking about that. Maybe we can collect reports at certain times, or all count the bees, the bumblebees, the honeybees, and maybe the butterflies. I mean, there's some way we've got to be monitoring to know we're working. This is working. So,
Okay, we had some more questions here.
Yes. What are pollinator partners? And I saw on the list all the towns around my town, but my town is not in it. How does that happen?
Yeah, so that would be a question for Barbara or you. So the slides that you guys had going at the beginning, Barbara, the slides that you had at the beginning that listed pollinator partners, the question is, who are the pollinator partners and why are
there's
those
a list of
groups on the list?
above the food table. So there are conservation commissions, garden clubs, 16 schools are growing pollinator plants to make a pollinator garden at their schools. Various organizations like the Land Trust, the Hanover Conservancy. There's just a long list of about 40 groups, organizations that are helping promote this.
and growing, and everyone is
growing,
is
yes.
welcome.
And so the other thing is that the people are disappears. Next, in May, on the 20th, is the Hanover Garden Club plant sale. One section will be devoted to pollinator plants there. So you can find these divisions from people's gardens. Let's see, what else was I going to say?
Yes.
But they're here while they last. So.
Okay, any more questions? Yes, Hugh?
So if you make a bee hotel or that little tiny house bee living thing you have right there, do you hang that in a tree under your eaves? It gets filled up in the summer, spring and summer, and then you leave it out all winter? And how do you handle those things?
Yeah, so on the back table, there is a one-page sheet that we brought that will explain if you're going to build one, what size holes, where to hang it, what to do with it, that sort of thing. But generally, you want to hang it where it's going to get morning sun. So bees like that warmth in the morning. You want to hang it high enough that it's not, you don't want it down where their cold, damp morning air collects, so high enough that it's out of that. Bees tend to navigate by landmarks, so if you hung it like on a post in the middle of a field, they would have a hard time navigating their way back to it, but if you hung it next to a tree or on the side of a barn or something that they can navigate to, they're going to be able to use it more easily. So yeah, it will get filled up with things throughout the summer, so you want to get it hanging as early as possible. We have native bees who start coming out early March, and they're looking for a place to nest, so having it out early, and then leave it out all summer, and it will get filled with all different species. And then you can leave it out for the winter. Birds they might peck out some of the males. It's okay. But you could also, they need to have that cold, that natural winter. So if you wanted to bring it in to protect it, you'd want to put it somewhere unheated. So you could put it in an unheated garage, for example. And then, yeah, you want to get it back out next spring before they start hatching out. So again, before early March. Yeah, and so you can reuse it. Yeah. Was that your question? Okay.
Any more questions?
All right, thank you.